Welcome to In Focus. I'm your host, Phan. April 30th, 1975 is a day that many of you will never forget, and for good reason. For some in particular, not only is that day memorable, but so is a warship called the USS Midway. Its role during that time of conflict is both unforgettable and remarkable. Join me as I take a tour of the Midway with one of its leading experts and find out how one ship saved over 3,000 people. You've seen the footage and you know this story. Many of you lived it, and to this day, it still feels like yesterday. Nearly 35 years after the fall of Saigon, the memories have not faded, and in some cases, the wounds have not yet healed. But come April 30th, 2010, those who were a part of the USS Midway rescue mission, known as Operation Frequent Wind, hope to celebrate and bring closure to that time.
My name is Scott McGaugh. I'm the marketing director aboard the USS Midway Museum. We've been open for about 6 years. We're the most visited floating ship museum in the world, and you're about to come aboard a remarkable aircraft carrier. It served for 47 years, the longest serving carrier of the 20th century.
The USS Midway was an aircraft carrier warship that was advanced beyond its time. It has served diligently and successfully for close to 50 years, and today it sits in the San Diego Bay, decommissioned and waiting for people to come see what it's all about.
We're about to go on a very special tour. We're going to show you some places where Vietnamese refugees on April 30th, 1975 came to Midway, how they were taken care of by Midway sailors on their way to America and a new future. When Midway was commissioned in 1945, it was by far the largest, most powerful, most sophisticated ship the world had ever seen. It was an engineering marvel based on the earlier kinds of carriers that were, and Navy ships that were at sea. And it remained that way for a long time. Obviously technology came along, computers. This was built before there were computers, literally in 1944, 1945. So it was an engineering marvel in its day, a real pioneer. It did a lot of pioneering things. Obviously, over the years, newer carriers came online and so on, but no carriers served nearly 50 years like the USS Midway did. Well, Operation Frequent Wind really became Midway and perhaps the Navy's most famous humanitarian mission. So Midway was about 75 miles off the coast. They had cleared this flight deck except for the helicopters. It was a gray day. It was raining slightly. It was hot. It was humid at the end of April. And the officers of Midway were waiting for the coded signal to begin the rescue. They were waiting for that signal to send out the helicopters, send them into Saigon and other places to pick up the refugees and bring them back to the flight deck. The signal that was going to be the start of the Operation Frequent Wind was when the military radio stations started playing "I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas" in April. That was the code. Once they heard that, they knew the evacuation was on. A dozen helicopters took off, headed ashore to begin the evacuation. There were several goals to Operation Frequent Wind. The first one, in some respects, was to get the last of the Americans out of Saigon, out of the embassy and those offices, and get them aboard. That took place on the 29th and the 30th, and certainly to bring aboard as many of the South Vietnamese that had supported Americans as possible. That went well the first day. It went according to plan. Things were pretty well organized. But the second day, April 30th, it was chaos. And part of that was because clearly the word had gotten out that Midway and other carriers were here, were in Vietnam to rescue. And pretty soon, South Vietnamese helicopters filled with women and children started coming out to Midway. That was extremely dangerous because those helicopters had no radio communications with the ship. They had different radios, different frequencies. So not only were the officers here trying to organize all the American helicopters that were landing every few minutes, but they had dozens of South Vietnamese helicopters hovering over the flight deck, waiting for hand signals to be allowed to come and land. Sometimes they had less than 10 minutes fuel left before they finally got on board.
Whether or not you were a part of the rescue effort aboard the USS Midway, I guarantee when you stand up on the flight deck on the exact same place where thousands of your countrymen once stood, hoping for salvation, it brings chills and a sense of wonder that no photo or story could ever do justice.
The air boss on Midway, the man who was in charge of the flight deck and air operations, he's a good friend and a docent on Midway today, museum docent. His proudest moment in a 30-year Navy career is that every single helicopter landed on Midway on April 30th safely. Every single refugee was taken care of. There was no loss of life. There were no injuries. He He was very proud of his sailors. Some sailors took it upon themselves to push helicopters over the side into the ocean in order to make room for other helicopters filled with refugees, because these other helicopters had no gas. They couldn't take off, and yet they desperately needed the room. So it was, again, very dangerous, but it was in many ways the USS Midway's finest hour out of 47 years of service.
One of the most famous accounts of that day involved a South Vietnamese pilot and his family who, without the help of the Midway, may have perished.
On the second day, Air Boss Vern Jumper and his crew were working with all the helicopters and so on, and all of a sudden a small plane appeared over Midway. Again, unplanned, no radio communications, no way to know what the pilot's intent was. The pilot flew over the flight deck, dropped a note. The first one missed the flight deck, flew over again. He dropped a second note written on a map. They were able to get the note. They took it up, written in Vietnamese, took it up to the island, to the admiral and the captain. They brought up a crewman who spoke Vietnamese to translate, and the note basically said that I am Major Bung Lee, I have 5 children aboard, I have 1 more hour of fuel, can you clear room, I can land. And the captain and the air boss had to make a decision. Are we going to allow a plane to land on an aircraft carrier without a tail hook? You know, the wires of the plane, he's never landed on an aircraft carrier. The plane isn't made for that. But they decided, yes, we're going to give him every chance to save his family. So again, they moved the helicopters around, made some room. He came around, he circled. The crew was instructed, don't forget, this is not a jet, it's got a propeller in front. Don't get too close to that. And as soon as the plane lands, you have to run out and grab it, because if it's windy, the plane might get blown overboard. And so they cleared the deck. He came in, he made a perfect landing right where we're standing. The crew ran out and secured the plane and tied it down to the flight deck. And the crew, who didn't know any of this, were amazed to see his wife get out holding a baby and 4 other small children come out of the luggage compartment in the back of the plane. If Midway had not been able to make room for him to land, he was going to have to land in the water, and maybe he and his wife would have gotten out of the cockpit. There's no chance the children would have survived. It was a remarkable story, remarkable accomplishment, and on our event on April 30th, we're hopeful that he's going to return to Midway and visit.
From top to bottom, the USS Midway is equivalent to a 22-story building, if you can imagine. At any given time, the Midway housed up to 4,500 sailors and was an asset during wartime.
Operation Frequent Wind was remarkable because it took place on such a dangerous place, the flight deck. And a lot of people don't realize just how dangerous a flight deck is when an aircraft carrier is at sea. This flight deck is 50 feet off the water. Midway oftentimes transited 50 feet. That's 50 feet up and 50 feet down. Try doing that for 2 or 3 days while you go around a typhoon. Plus, a lot of people don't realize that for flight operations to take place, there has to be 30 knots of wind on the flight deck for the planes to get their lift. So not only are you working in an environment where you're doing this all the time with no fence, 50 feet off the water, but you're working in a 30-knot wind all the time in all kinds of weather conditions. So it's very easy to lose your concentration, get caught behind a plane, and get literally blown over the side. Or something worse if you get in front of a jet engine. Planes are running, the jets are running, they're moving around the flight deck constantly. It takes an extraordinary amount of teamwork and training to make sure that accidents don't happen, but unfortunately they do. You know, Operation Frequent Wind was the end of the Vietnam conflict, and there were sailors and pilots aboard Midway on that day who had been aboard Midway years earlier flying combat missions over North Vietnam. Many of them, in fact. Midway spent several years during the war in combat over North Vietnam. This aircraft, the F-4 Phantom, literally was a very famous one. These 2 pilots in this plane shot down 2 North Vietnamese pilots in Russian-made MiGs, literally on the same day, only 10 minutes apart, in a very famous air battle over Hanoi. So Midway played a role during the combat era and then played an important role during Operation Frequent Wind.
Because this year marks 35 years since the Midway rescued over 3,000 refugees, they are planning a big celebration and are inviting anyone who is on that ship to contact them for a special invitation. They're hoping to bring together former sailors and refugees to be a part of the event, which is sure to be an emotional and meaningful time.
You know, April 30th is the 35th anniversary of April 30th, 1975. And we feel as a museum it's important to help reunite, if you will, the Midway sailors who were there, as well as the refugees who were there in 1975. The problem, of course, is they're all over the country. There is no master list of who they are or their whereabouts. So we're spreading the word as much as we can through help like yourself to encourage and invite Midway sailors and refugees to come join us for a very special ceremony right here on this flight deck at 12 noon on April 30th. It's going to be a day of memory and I think maybe a healing, an opportunity to say thank you, perhaps certainly a day of respect and honor. It's the first time to our knowledge any of this has ever taken place. So we're hopeful that people will let us know at the museum where these people are so that we can issue a special invitation for what promises to be a very special day.
Coming up after the break, find out where former refugees ate and slept the night the USS Midway saved their lives. You won't want to miss it. Stay with us.
SBTN là đài truyền hình Việt ngữ đầu tiên phát hình 24 giờ qua hệ thống DirecTV và cable trên toàn cõi Hoa Kỳ và Canada. SBTN phục vụ khán giả hàng ngày với lượng tin tức cập nhật sáng, trưa, chiều, tối, dồi dào, đáng tin cậy cùng hàng loạt tin tức địa phương từ Little Saigon, San Jose, Dallas, Houston đến Washington DC, Boston, Toronto và Việt Nam. Phim bộ hấp dẫn lôi cuốn, cải lương đặc sắc, tâm tình nghệ sĩ thú vị, vui tươi, nhạc yêu cầu thấm thiết chân tình, thể thao văn nghệ đời sống sống động hào hứng, Victoria Show với thế giới điện ảnh kỳ thú mới lạ. SBTN luôn đồng hành với khán giả qua các diễn đàn và những phiên phóng sự nóng bỏng, ghi nhận các sinh hoạt văn hóa, giáo dục, chính trị, xã hội của người Việt khắp nơi trên thế giới và tại quê nhà, cùng với những nhận định thực tế, sắc bén của các thức giả đương đại. SBTN đáp ứng nhu cầu của mọi giới, mọi lứa tuổi qua các chương trình tìm hiểu luật pháp, di trú tị nạn, sức khỏe và đời sống, thể dục dưỡng sinh, em học tiếng Việt, lịch sử Việt Nam, hàng loạt chương trình giải trí phong phú lành mạnh như Người mẫu Việt Nam, Hành trình xuyên Việt, sân khấu cuối tuần, cùng với các cuộc thi thố tài năng hào hứng sôi nổi qua các show Đố Ai, giải sáng tác hay nhất, giải những thước phim vàng sẽ lần lượt khởi chiếu trên SBTN. Mọi chi tiết về chương trình, ghi danh quảng cáo bảo trợ xin vào website www.sbtn.tv. SBTN hân hạnh giới thiệu DVD Người mẫu Việt Nam với cuộc thi tài sắc đầy hào hứng của 20 cô gái Việt trẻ đẹp, duyên dáng cùng chương trình ca nhạc đặc sắc với sự góp mặt của các tiếng hát trẻ trung được ái mộ nhất hiện nay: Thiên Kim, Lâm Nhật Tiến, Quốc Khanh, Đoàn Phi, Nguyễn Hồng Nhung, Christine Sa, Như Quỳnh, Đan Nguyên. 20 kiều nữ Việt, 20 niềm hy vọng, nhưng chỉ có duy nhất một danh hiệu Top Model, nên họ đã trải qua nhiều thử thách gay go, sôi nổi, phô trương những nét tuyệt mỹ và tài năng, đặc biệt nhất qua các chương trình biểu diễn thời trang và phong cách.
We're lining up to go out on the runway and then we heard this boom.
It's actually my mom's idea. She knew that this was a passion of mine since I was very young.
Kính thưa quý vị, người đã thắng giải Top Model năm 2008 là thí sinh.
Ai là Top Model 2008? Hãy mua DVD Người mẫu Việt Nam do Trung tâm Asia phát hành ngày 31 tháng 12 năm 2008.
Welcome back to In Focus. I'm your host, Phan. Before the break, we got a chance to go on the flight deck of the USS Midway and see the place where thousands of Vietnamese refugees got a chance of freedom. In this segment, we'll take you down to the hangar and to the rooms to see where they went after they boarded the ship.
We're now on the hangar deck. Midway has 2,000 rooms, and this is by far the largest one of them. This is where the planes were stored and worked on. It was the garage on Midway. So planes would be stored here, they'd be repaired, they'd be taken out on a flight elevator and up to the flight deck. Operation Frequent Wind was a different matter. Again, almost all of the planes were off the ship. The helicopters stayed up on the flight deck, so when those refugees were taken off the helicopters, they were brought down right here, right away. There were cots and chairs, there were doctors and corpsmen, there were men from the galley, the restaurants, and every refugee was checked to see what he or she needed, and then taken to wherever they might need to go for whatever it was they needed. By the end of Operation Frequent Wind, with more than 3,000 refugees aboard, plus the Midway sailors, the crew, there weren't enough bunks or beds for everyone. So unfortunately, for a night or two, some of them had to sleep here on this hangar deck, on mattresses, even on bubble wrap, because there were so many people here until arrangements could be made. So this is where they came to get out of the danger of the flight deck, get checked out, and some of them spent their first night in America, so to speak, right here in this room. Many sailors who were aboard Midway on April 30th, 1975 have come back to visit Midway. I've had the opportunity to interview several for some of the books I've written on the history of Midway. And all of them, to a man, have said the thing that they're most proud of is that they met the mission of rescuing as many families as possible with no one getting hurt. That it wasn't just a matter of getting the job done, but doing it professionally, doing it with courtesy, doing it with respect. Remember, some of these sailors were in Vietnam even on Midway for many years in a combat mode, an entirely different mindset than now rescuing families or portions of families. And yet they were able to adjust, they were able to perform their duties with their heart, you know, instead of their minds, if you will, in some ways. And I think it's the training that saw them through that. And I think they're most proud of Midway answering the call in a humanitarian way and saving lives instead of perhaps taking lives, if you will, in combat. So this is the way the refugees would go to a number of areas where there were beds. Here they are. Bunk beds, 3 high, 6 feet long. There would be anywhere from 100 to 300 beds like this in any given room. And of course, with 4,500 men and 4,500 bunks, they're all over the ship, nests of bunks in a way. So they would come down here once they were checked, and maybe they went to sick bay, the hospital, you know, got taken care of or whatever. And then there was bedding and everything here and some personal items. And this is where they would stay. These are the bunks that the sailors used, and a lot of Midway sailors during Operation Frequent Wind gave up their bunks, slept on the hangar deck, so families could at least stay together, or portions of families, down here and sleep together the first night. A lot of Midway sailors gave up their beds so that mom and 2 daughters, you know, could stay together. Another thing that the refugees weren't prepared for, that had to be scary, is how loud it is on an aircraft carrier. This is solid steel, so sound carries everywhere. If we were here now, you would hear you'd jump at the helicopters landing right over you. You know, up on the flight deck, they'd be so loud. This is part of the equipment that controls the anchor and the anchor chain. So, and literally the anchor chain, each link weighs 130 pounds. So I can just imagine when this thing is turning, how loud it is in here when you're trying to sleep. Not all the beds were in private bedrooms by any stretch. You know, there was oftentimes ship's equipment while guys were trying, or refugees, were trying to sleep.
Were these rooms like named, so you know which?
No.
Oh, really?
No. 2,000 rooms, you don't have names. Now, you would call this forward berthing, you know, forward berthing kind of a thing, but this is more than you need to know, but I'll show you. Rooms don't have name. Well, some of them do. The galley, sick bay, but all the, you know, this is not bedroom 24. You know, they don't call it that. But instead, there are these all over the ship, and about every 10 feet. And this tells you where you are on the ship. It's a code. So the refugees never knew what this name of this compartment was or what its number was. There were Midway sailors escorting them everywhere. Okay. They wouldn't have any. They get lost in a heartbeat. So they were escorted here and made sure they were taken care of. Sailors came and got them in the morning to take them to the nearest galley for breakfast the next morning, or sick bay, hospital, or whatever the case might be. Because with 2,000 rooms, it's very easy to get lost. And it's dangerous wandering around if you don't know where you're going and you're 8 years old.
At that time, were there a lot of Vietnamese interpreters, I guess, because was the language barrier?
Yes, language was a challenge. Midway had a number of sailors, crew members who spoke Vietnamese. As I was saying earlier, it was crucial when that pilot, Bung Le, was above the flight deck. But I don't know that they had enough. They just did the best they could. Just do the best you can. And I think a lot of times in that kind of environment, you see it, I've seen it when I've traveled internationally, you can communicate a lot with hand signals, you know, in terms of, you know, this way, you know, kind of a thing. And you catch on pretty quickly that this is where you're going to eat or this is where you're going to sleep. And again, many refugees only stayed maybe a day or two on Midway. And then they were sent to Guam to a processing camp, and then on to Camp Pendleton. That was the most common place. I think there were 4 in the U.S. Camp Pendleton was one of the big ones for their sponsors, and then they went off from there. So they did not spend a lot of time on Midway.
This is kind of the gateway.
Yeah, halfway house transition. Yeah, their first landing spot out of the country, South Vietnam, on their way to America. For many refugees during Operation Frequent Wind, this is where they got their first meal. They were brought down on the hangar deck, were taken care of. If it was time to get something to eat, there were dozens and dozens of cooks and chefs and servers ready to go down here in the galley. Midway had 6 galleys. This is the largest one. They were ready to serve, and they were serving almost 24 hours around the clock as these helicopters kept coming with refugees of all ages. They wanted to make sure they got something to eat and water and drinks and so on. And so this galley was operating just about around the clock. Midway had 6 galleys. And they were used to something like this. Midway's cooks routinely, for 4,500 men, had to cook 13,000 meals every single day. 10 tons of food. So from their perspective, this wasn't too different than a regular day. 6,000 people perhaps was a little bit more than usual, but they were used to preparing huge amounts of food and operating almost around the clock. It was just at this time during Operation Frequent Wind, they had some very special guests.
How is this ship able to store that much food for that long span of time?
It's not.
Okay.
Every 3 days, when Midway was at sea, some kind of supply ship would pull up alongside Midway, match course and speed about 150 feet apart, shoot lines across, and then resupply some aspect of anything that a small town consumes, from food, fuel, typewriter ribbon, paper, x-ray film, detergent, clothes, anything a small town consumes. At some point, Midway would have to be resupplied with that. It's called UNREP, underway replenishment. And Midway went through 10 tons of food a day, but could only store about a week's worth, 70 tons. So there was almost always some kind of grocery store or gas station pulling up alongside Midway to resupply. When I have had the opportunity to meet refugees from 1975 who have returned to Midway, the amount of gratitude and appreciation is overwhelming. Every one of them wish terribly they could find the Midway sailors who are now spread out across the country and somehow say thank you. Because I think with time, as they've built new lives in America, their appreciation for what Midway and the other ships did during that time has only grown. They were in shock. When you look at the photos of that day, I can only imagine the shock those poor families were going through, leaving grandparents behind, or children behind, or a father behind. So they didn't have an opportunity, I don't think, to talk with the Midway sailors much at that time. But over time, and they now come back, they very much want to say thank you. They want to pay their respects to those who made a new life possible. And that's part of what April 30th, 2010 is going to be all about. A lot of tears, a lot of emotion. Many times, Midway sailors, as well as the refugees, if I know they're coming and I greet them or whatever, I know that within the first 5 minutes, I'm going to need to step back and let them grieve in their own way. The tears will start flowing. Memories come in. You don't ask what it is. You just step back and give them their time and space, and then they're embarrassed, you know. But you just step back and let them go through their time, and then we continue on. It's a privilege to give them that opportunity. 35 years after the end of the war, for many people, the scars, I think, sometimes are as tender as ever. I think sometimes I've seen it. People have adjusted, they've put it behind them, and yet when they come aboard Midway, a lot of feelings come back to the surface. And many times they're unprepared for it. They're surprised at perhaps reliving some of the pain, some of the loss, the disappointment, the fear. Again, you look at the photos and videotape from that day, the fear was just etched on their faces. And so you see that when they come back. They also come back and are fiercely patriotic about what America means to them, what America has meant to their family. Even though in some ways their family may have been broken up at the end of the war for a lot of different reasons, they still come back very appreciative, very grateful, and very passionate about the values of the American culture and the American way of life.
April 30th, 2010 will mark 35 years, and they are planning a special ceremony to mark that milestone. Remember, if you were a survivor and on that ship 35 years ago, they want to know and contact you. You can email me or the address on the screen for more information. If you live here in Southern California, I urge you to make the trip to the USS Midway, even if you weren't on it, to see what human decency and salvation looks like. Until next time, we hope you learn more, live more, and always stay in focus. Thanks for watching.